She was marrying a stranger to save a dying legacy. Eleanor Vance clutched the wilting desert flowers in her hands, their bruised petals a mirror of her own spirit. Her future was being traded for water rights, and the man she was about to marry was the price. Today, it felt like it was witnessing both at once. The birth of a humiliating arrangement and the death of her dreams. Her father, Walter Vance, stood beside the smirking land baron, Silas Croft. Walter's shoulders were slumped, his eyes fixed on the worn-out toes of his boots. He was a good man broken by a bad drought and even worse decisions. He had borrowed too much from Croft, believing the rains would come. But the skies had remained a stubborn, cloudless blue, and the debt had grown like a cancer, choking the life from their ranch. This marriage was Silas Croft's solution. A cruel, theatrical display of his power. A union, Croft had called it, his voice slick as oil. A treaty between your family and the Apache. Their chief agrees to share the water from their sacred spring, and all you have to do is welcome his son into your family. It solves everyone's problems. But Eleanor knew it wasn't a solution. It was a sentence. She looked at the man who stood opposite her, waiting. His name was Neshoba. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and thick-set, his heavy frame straining the seams of the simple leather tunic he wore. His black hair was long and unadorned, and his face, weathered by sun and wind, was a mask of stoic indifference. He was, to the whispering onlookers from town, an obese, silent savage. To Eleanor, he was the embodiment of her family's failure. She had imagined her wedding day since she was a little girl. She'd pictured a handsome rancher with kind eyes, someone who could ride beside her, work the land with her, and understand the language of the wind and the earth as she did. She never, in her wildest nightmares, pictured this. A forced alliance with a stranger from a world she did not understand. A man whose silence felt more threatening than any shout. The preacher, a nervous man named Reverend Michael, cleared his throat, his words tumbling out in a hurried rush, as if he were eager for the ordeal to be over. He spoke of unity and partnership, but his words were hollow, lost in the oppressive silence of the dry air. Eleanor could feel the stares of the townspeople Croft had invited to witness his triumph. She heard their whispers, sharp and cruel as burrs. "Look at him," a woman hissed from the small crowd. "Hardly fits in his own skin. Walter must be truly desperate to sell his girl to the likes of that." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She kept her eyes forward, focusing on a loose thread on the preacher's collar. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Her braided blonde hair, usually a source of pride, felt heavy on her shoulders, like a chain. This was her duty. This was the price of her father's mistakes. "Do you, Eleanor Vance, take this man, Neshoba, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the preacher asked, his voice cracking under the strain. The world seemed to stop. Every eye was on her. Her father finally looked up, his face a canvas of shame and regret. "Forgive me," his eyes pleaded. Silas Croft's grin widened, savoring her humiliation. Eleanor took a shaky breath, the dust filling her lungs. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper, fragile as a dry leaf. "I do." The preacher turned to Neshoba. "And do you, Neshoba, take this woman?" The big man did not wait for the question to be finished. A low sound rumbled from his chest, a sound like stones grinding together deep within the earth. "Yes." The single word carried a weight that startled Eleanor. It was not the grunt she had expected. It was deep, resonant, and held a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. There was no escape now. They were pronounced husband and wife. There was no kiss. There was only a profound and awkward silence, broken by Silas Croft's slow, deliberate applause. He stepped forward and clapped Walter on the back, a gesture that was more of a blow than a comfort. "You see, Walter, all your problems solved," Croft declared loudly, for everyone to hear. "The Vance Ranch is saved. The town will have water. A new era of peace is upon us." But as Eleanor stood beside her new husband, she felt no peace. She felt only the crushing weight of a bargain she didn't make and a future she couldn't comprehend. Neshoba remained silent, his dark eyes scanning the parched land of his new home. He seemed to look right through the sagging fences and the wilting crops, as if seeing something else entirely. Something hidden. As the small crowd dispersed, led by Croft toward the barrels of cheap whiskey he'd provided for the grim celebration. Eleanor felt a presence at her side. It was her father. "Eleanor, he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Don't, Papa," she said, her own voice hard, a shield against the pain. "It's done. Let's not pretend it's anything other than what is." He flinched and retreated, leaving her alone with the stranger she was now bound to. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a beautiful funeral for the life she had known. She had expected Neshoba to say something, to give some order or make some demand. But he simply stood there, a silent, imposing statue. Finally, feeling the need to break the suffocating tension, she spoke. "The house is this way." She turned and began walking toward the small, weathered ranch house her great-grandfather had built. She did not look back to see if he was following. She simply walked, her steps stiff and proud, a queen marching to her own prison. The rustle of his moccasins on the dry earth behind her was the only sound that confirmed he was there. The ride from her family's homestead to the small cabin they were to share was the longest mile of Eleanor's life. Her father had insisted the small line cabin at the edge of their property be prepared for them. It was his feeble attempt to give her a sliver of independence, but it felt more like an exile. Neshoba drove the wagon. His large hands held the leather reins with a surprising gentleness, his movements economical and sure. He had not spoken another word since the ceremony. His silence was a wall between them, thick and impenetrable. Eleanor sat as far away from him as the wagon seat would allow, her hands clenched in her lap. She expected this silence to be one of ignorance or apathy. She assumed he was a simple man, perhaps overwhelmed by these new circumstances. But as they crested a small rise that overlooked the northern pasture, he finally spoke, his deep voice startling her. "The fence is weak there," he said, nodding toward a stretch of barbed wire held up by leaning, weathered posts. "By the dry creek bed." Eleanor blinked, surprised. "I know. We haven't had the time or the money to fix it." "It was not time or money that weakened it," he replied, his gaze fixed on the fence line. "The posts were cut, not rotted. Cut with a saw, halfway through, just below the soil line, so they would fall with the first hard wind." Her head snapped toward him. "What are you talking about?" "No one would. Your foreman, Jebediah," Neshoba said, his tone flat, stating a fact, not an opinion. "He wants your cattle to wander. Easier to claim they were lost to predators than to admit he sold them." Eleanor's stomach twisted into a cold knot. "Jebediah has been with my father for 20 years. He's like family. Loyalty is a luxury when a man's pockets are empty," Neshoba said, still not looking at her. "And his pockets are not empty. He buys whiskey in town every week. Pays with coin, not credit." How could he know that? How could this stranger, who had been on her land for less than a day, know the intimate, secret failings of her ranch? She had been so consumed by the drought, by the big, obvious disaster, that she had been blind to the smaller betrayals happening right under her nose. "That's impossible," she whispered, though the words lacked conviction. She thought of the missing calves her father had blamed on coyotes. She thought of Jebediah's sudden trips to town, his sour mood whenever she asked about the herd count. Neshoba finally turned his head, and his eyes met hers for the first time. They were not dull or vacant. They were dark, intelligent, and piercing, like the eyes of a hawk. They saw everything. "It is also impossible for a well to run slow in a drought," he continued, his voice low. "A drought means the water table drops. The well should run dry, not slow, unless something is blocking the flow." "What are you saying?" "I am saying your well is being poisoned. Slowly. Not with poison to kill, but with gravel and sand. Poured in at night, a little at a time. Enough to choke the pump, to make the water taste of grit. Enough to make a man desperate." The wagon hit a rut, and Eleanor grabbed the seat to steady herself. Her mind was reeling. The constant pump repairs, the grit in their drinking water, her father's growing despair. It all clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. This wasn't just bad luck. They were being attacked. Systematically. "Who would do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The man who profits from your desperation," Neshoba answered simply. "The man who arranged this marriage. Silas Croft." They pulled up to the small line cabin as the last light of day bled from the sky. It was a simple, one-room structure, but her father's men had cleaned it, stacked firewood by the door, and left a lantern burning in the window. It was supposed to be a home. Right now, it felt like a bunker in the middle of a war she hadn't even known she was fighting. She sat frozen on the wagon seat, staring at the cabin. Everything she thought she knew had been upended in a single wagon ride. Her family wasn't just failing. They were being dismantled, piece by piece, by the very man who had pretended to be their savior. And the silent stranger beside her, the man she had feared and resented, had seen it all. "How?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "How do you know these things?" Neshoba set the brake and wrapped the reins around the handle. He stepped down from the wagon, his large frame moving with a deliberate grace that seemed impossible for his size. He looked up at her, his face shadowed in the twilight. "Because for a month, I have watched this land," he said. "My people have watched. We watch the wind, the animals, the stars. We also watch the men who move across our lands. We listen to their whispers in town. We see the tracks they leave behind. I came to this marriage to honor my father's word, but I did not come blind." He walked toward the cabin door, then paused. He turned back to her, and in the dim light, she could see an unexpected emotion in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to resolve. "You believe you were sold to save your ranch," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "You were not. You were the final move in a game you did not know you were playing. Croft does not want your ranch to survive. He wants it to die, and he believes I am the weapon that will deliver the final blow." He disappeared inside the cabin, leaving Eleanor sitting alone in the growing darkness. The cool night air felt heavy on her skin. She was not the wife of a simple, ignorant man. She was the wife of a warrior, a strategist, a man who saw the truth in the cut fence posts and the sand-filled well. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, a flicker of something other than fear ignited within her. It was a dangerous, unfamiliar spark of hope. The game was not over. Her opponent had just revealed himself. And, she realized with a jolt, she was no longer playing it alone. Eleanor found him by the cold hearth, examining the stonework as if it were a map. The single lantern cast long, dancing shadows across the cabin, making the small space feel even more confining. Papers and ledgers from the ranch, which her father had sent over, sat in a neat pile on the small wooden table. Neshoba had already been through them. He seemed to absorb information with the same silent intensity he applied to everything else. "Jebediah will be here in the morning to deliver the week's supplies," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She needed a plan, a course of action. Sitting in stunned silence was a luxury she couldn't afford. Neshoba turned from the fireplace. "Good. We will speak with him then." "Speak with him?" she scoffed, a bit of her old fire returning. "He's been robbing us blind, sabotaging our home. He needs to be run off this land, or thrown in jail." "And what proof do you offer the sheriff?" Neshoba asked calmly. "Your word against a man your father has trusted for 2 decades. Croft owns the judge in this county. Jebediah will walk free, and Croft will know we are aware of his game. We would lose our only advantage, surprise." He was right, of course. His logic was as solid and unmovable as a mountain. It was infuriating. She was used to being the one who saw things clearly, the one who made the sensible plans while her father chased his hopes. "So what do we do?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Let him keep stealing from us?" "No," Neshoba said. He walked to the table and picked up a ledger. He opened it to a page filled with her own neat handwriting, detailing livestock counts. "We set a trap, but a trap is only as good as the bait. Tell me about Silas Croft." For the next hour, Eleanor talked. She told him everything. She spoke of Croft's arrival in the territory 5 years ago, a wealthy man from the east with a friendly smile and a wallet full of cash. He bought up failing properties, offering prices that seemed generous at first. He loaned money to ranchers struggling with the drought, presenting himself as a friend and neighbor. But always there was a catch. The deeds he held had clauses in the fine print. The loans had interest rates that would cripple a king. He preys on desperation, Eleanor concluded, her voice laced with bitterness. "My father saw him as a friend. He never believed a man could smile so much and be so cruel. A smiling wolf is still a wolf," Neshoba said, his eyes never leaving her face as she spoke. He was listening not just to her words, but to the pain and anger behind them. For the first time, She felt truly heard. "He wants the water," she said. "That's what this has all been about. The spring on your people's land is the only reliable source in 3 counties. With our ranch and those water rights, he'd have a monopoly. He could starve out every other rancher." Neshoba was silent for a long moment, studying the map of their property that was pinned to the wall. His large finger traced the line that marked the border with his tribe's land. "No," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "It is not the water." Eleanor stared at him. "What? Of course it is. There's nothing else out here. Just rock, dust, and regret." "The water is the excuse," he explained, turning to face her fully. "It is the reason everyone can see. The reason the sheriff will accept when conflict arises. The real prize is hidden. My people have known of it for generations. We have protected it." He paused. "Croft is not a rancher. He is a prospector. He is not looking for grass for cattle. He is looking for the silver that sleeps in the heart of that mountain." He pointed on the map to the dark, jagged peaks that stood on the border of their lands. The Vance Ranch controlled the only accessible pass into that range. The revelation struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. Silver. It was always silver or gold, the fever that drove men mad, that made them abandon all decency and honor. Croft wasn't building a cattle empire. He was planning to build mine. The water wasn't for livestock. It was for sluicing tons of ore. The treaty, the marriage, it was all a lie, a complex and cruel piece of theater designed to give him legal access to a mountain of silver, with an Apache treaty to make it all look legitimate. "My father," Eleanor breathed, sinking onto a stool. "He has no idea. He truly believed this was about saving the ranch." "A desperate man is easy to deceive," Neshoba said, his voice holding no judgment, only a sad truth. A heavy silence fell between them, filled with the weight of this new, terrible understanding. Outside, the coyotes began their nightly calls, their lonely cries echoing in the vast, empty darkness. Eleanor felt a profound sense of isolation. They were 2 people, bound by a ceremony that meant nothing, standing against a man who held all the power, all the money, and all the law in his pocket. "What chance do we have?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Neshoba walked over to the cabin's single window and looked out into the night. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire space. "The hawk does not fight the storm," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It uses the wind to rise above it. Croft thinks he is the storm. He does not know the winds have changed." The next morning, Jebediah arrived as promised, his wagon rattling up the dusty track to the cabin. He was a wiry man with shifty eyes and a perpetual sneer. He swung down from the driver's seat and began unloading a sack of flour with a resentful heave. "Brought your supplies," he grunted, not looking at Eleanor. His eyes flickered toward Neshoba, who stood silently in the cabin doorway, and the sneer on his face deepened. "Thank you, Jebediah," Eleanor said, her voice cool and level. "There's something we need to discuss." Jebediah's eyes narrowed. "I ain't got time for chatter. Got work to do." "This is about your work," Neshoba said. His voice, calm and deep, cut through the morning air and made Jebediah freeze. The foreman turned slowly, his hand instinctively dropping to rest near the handle of the knife on his belt. "You got something to say to me, Chief?" Jebediah spat, the insult dripping with venom. Neshoba ignored the slur. He took a single, deliberate step out of the doorway and into the sunlight. His shadow fell over the smaller man. "The count for the northern herd was short by 6 head last month," Neshoba stated. "The month before by 8. Jebediah forced a laugh, but sounded brittle. "Coyote's been bad. Your new husband don't know much about ranchin', Eleanor. Maybe you should stick to whatever it is you people do." "The coyotes have been hungry," Neshoba agreed calmly. "But they do not leave wagon tracks leading to the stockyards in Dusty Gulch. And they do not pay for their meals with silver coin at the saloon." The color drained from Jebediah's face. His hand tightened on his knife. "That's a lie. You can't prove nothing." "Proof is for a courtroom," Neshoba said, his voice dropping lower. "Here, on this land, there is only truth. You have betrayed the man who trusted you. You have stolen from the family that fed you. You think you could just waltz in here and start giving orders?" Jebediah snarled, emboldened by his own fear. He took a step forward, puffing out his chest. "You're nothing. Just some fat, savage Walter bought to keep the others off his land." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She expected an explosion of violence. She expected this mountain of a man to break Jebediah in two. Instead, Neshoba did something she never expected. He smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was slow, sad, and utterly terrifying. "You believe my size is a weakness," Neshoba said, his voice barely a whisper. "You believe it makes me slow. You believe it is a sign of softness. That is your mistake." Before Jebediah could even process the words, Neshoba moved. It was not a rush, but a fluid, impossibly fast motion, a surge of controlled power like a river breaking a dam. He closed the distance between them in a single step. His left hand, huge and powerful, shot out and clamped around Jebediah's knife hand. His right hand seized the front of the foreman's shirt. Jebediah gave a choked cry as he was lifted, his feet dangling a foot off the ground. The knife clattered uselessly to the dirt. He struggled, his face turning a blotchy red, but he was as helpless as a child in the grip of a giant bear. Neshoba held him there, eye to eye, his expression one of grim disappointment. "Strength is not in the noise a man makes," Neshoba said, his voice still quiet, yet carrying an authority that was absolute. "It is in the choices he makes when he thinks no one is watching. You have made your choices. Now, you will unmake them." He set Jebediah back on the ground. The foreman stumbled, gasping for air, his eyes wide with a terror that had replaced his earlier bravado. "The money you stole," Neshoba continued, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will return every last dollar. You will repair the fence you cut, and then you will be gone from this land before the sun sets. If I ever see your face on Vance property again, I will not be this patient." Jebediah stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the slow, silent man he had mocked with the terrifying force of nature that had just subdued him without throwing a single punch. He scrambled to pick up his knife, nodded frantically, and all but ran to his wagon, whipping the horses into a panicked retreat. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Neshoba, who stood watching the wagon disappear in a cloud of dust. He had not been violent. He had been dominant. He had used his mind to expose the man, and his strength only to punctuate the lesson. He turned and looked at her, his face returning to its usual stoic calm, though she could now see the intelligence that burned brightly behind his eyes. "That was the easy part," he said. "Jebediah is just a symptom of the disease. Now, we must find a way to deal with the sickness itself." He meant Silas Croft, and Eleanor knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that the fight for her family's legacy had just truly begun. The departure of Jebediah left a void on the ranch, not just in manpower, but in morale. The other ranch hands, loyal men who had worked for Walter for years, were confused and unsettled. They had heard Jebediah's side of the story before he fled, a wild tale of being threatened by Eleanor's savage husband. Fear and suspicion began to poison the air. Men who had known Eleanor since she was a child now looked at her with guarded eyes, their gazes lingering on Neshoba with a mixture of fear and contempt. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. It was in the way they avoided her gaze, the way they fell silent when she approached the bunkhouse. They were good men, but they were simple men, and fear was a powerful poison. "They're afraid of you," she told Neshoba one evening as they sat at the small table in the cabin, a map of the ranch spread between them. "They see you as a threat. They are afraid of what they do not understand," Neshoba corrected gently. He was sharpening a large hunting knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel a calming sound in the quiet cabin. "Croft will use that. He will whisper in their ears, tell them I am here to take their jobs, their land. He will turn your own people against you. Then we have to show them they're wrong," Eleanor insisted. "They need to see you as I am beginning to see you." The admission hung in the air between them, a fragile, unspoken truth. She saw him not as a savage, but as a man of quiet strength and surprising wisdom, a man who saw the world in a way she was only just beginning to comprehend. Neshoba paused his work, his dark eyes meeting hers across the flickering lamplight. "Trust is not given. It is earned, and it is earned by actions, not words. The next day, their chance came. A report came from one of the younger ranch hands, a boy named Sam, that a section of the southern pasture fence was down and a dozen head of cattle were missing. The other hands immediately blamed it on Neshoba, muttering that the Apache were stealing their stock, just as they had always feared. The atmosphere was tense, ready to explode. "It's Croft's doing," Eleanor said to Neshoba in a low voice as the hands gathered their horses, their faces grim. "He's testing us, trying to create chaos." "Then we will not give him chaos," Neshoba replied. "We will give him surprise." He walked out to face the muttering men. They fell silent as he approached, their hands resting warily on their hips. "The cattle are not stolen," Neshoba announced, his voice carrying easily over the morning breeze. "They have been driven into the canyons by men who wanted us to think they were stolen." One of the older hands, a grizzled man named Hank, spat on the ground. "And how would you know that?" "Because I have read the story the land has told me," Neshoba said. He knelt and picked up a handful of dirt from near the broken fence line. He let it sift through his fingers. There are hoof prints from shod horses mixed with the cattle tracks. Shod horses ridden hard. Our horses were in the corral all night, and the tracks lead south, into the maze of canyons where a dozen cattle can disappear for weeks. He stood and faced them, his gaze sweeping over their skeptical faces. "If we go after them with a dozen men on horseback, we will scatter them further. We will lose half the herd in the rocks. But one man, moving on foot, who knows the canyons and knows how cattle think, can bring them back." He paused. "I will bring them back." A murmur of disbelief went through the men. Go into the canyons on foot? Alone? It was suicide. The canyons were a labyrinth of treacherous cliffs and dead ends, a place where a man could get lost and never be seen again. "You?" Hank scoffed. "You'll be lost before noon." Eleanor stepped forward. "He knows the land better than any of us. Let him try." The men looked at her, then back at Neshoba. It was a test, and everyone knew it. If he failed, their suspicions would be confirmed. If he succeeded, well, that was something they couldn't even imagine. Neshoba gave Eleanor a single, brief nod of thanks. He gathered a small leather pouch of water and a length of rope. Without another word, he set off on foot toward the southern canyons, his large frame moving with a steady, ground-eating pace. He disappeared over the rise, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. For 2 days, there was no word. The tension on the ranch grew thick and suffocating. Eleanor found it impossible to rest. She paced the small cabin, her mind filled with images of Neshoba lost, injured, or worse. Silas Croft, she knew, would not hesitate to have him killed. He had likely sent men into the canyons not just to drive the cattle, but to ensure Neshoba never came back. Her father, Walter, rode out to the cabin, his face etched with worry. "This was a mistake, Eleanor. The men are on the verge of walking off. They say he's run off and left us to deal with the mess." "He will be back," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised even herself. "He will do what he said he would do." On the evening of the second day, just as the sun was setting, a lookout on the ridge gave a shout. Eleanor and the ranch hands rushed out to see a cloud of dust rising from the mouth of the southern canyon. As it drew closer, they could make out the shapes of the missing cattle, moving in a calm, orderly bunch. And behind them, walking with the same steady, unhurried pace as when he left, was Neshoba. He was covered in dust, and his face was etched with fatigue, but he was unharmed. He guided the cattle effortlessly through the pasture gate, his low, calm voice seeming to soothe the animals. He had done the impossible. The ranch hands stood in stunned silence. They had spent their lives working cattle, and they knew what a feat this was. They had seen a dozen men fail to do what this one man had accomplished alone, on foot. They looked at him with new eyes, their fear and suspicion slowly being replaced by a grudging, undeniable respect. Hank was the first to speak. He walked up to Neshoba, his hat in his hands. I don't know how you did that," he stammered, "but we're grateful. We were wrong about you." Neshoba simply nodded, accepting the apology without any sign of triumph. "The land provides the path for those who are willing to see it," he said. Later that night, as Eleanor cleaned the cuts and scrapes on Neshoba's arms, a comfortable silence settled between them. The barrier of resentment and fear that had once defined their marriage was gone, replaced by a shared purpose and a growing, unspoken admiration. "You did more than just bring back the cattle," she said softly, her touch gentle on his skin. "You brought back our hope. You showed the men that strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. And you showed them what it means to have faith," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. In their depths, she saw a warmth that had not been there before. "You stood by me when they all doubted." "What?" Eleanor paused her work, the damp cloth resting in her hand. Because I've seen the story the land has told me, too," she whispered. "And it tells me you are an honorable man, Neshoba." He reached out and gently took her hand, his large, calloused fingers closing around hers. It was the first time they had touched in a way that was not born of necessity. His touch was warm, firm, and reassuring. It spoke of a connection that went deeper than their forced vows, a partnership forged in the crucible of shared adversity. "Then we will face what comes next together, Eleanor," he said, his voice a solemn promise. "As partners." She met his gaze, and for the first time, the word husband did not feel like a cage. It felt like a shield, a fortress. They still had a war to win, but they were no longer two strangers fighting separate battles. They were a united front, and as Silas Croft would soon discover, that made them a very dangerous enemy indeed. With the loyalty of the ranch hands secured, the atmosphere at the Vance homestead began to change. The men worked with a new sense of purpose, their respect for Neshoba growing with each passing day. He taught them his people's methods for finding water, for tracking game, for reading the signs of the weather in the clouds and the behavior of the animals. He wasn't just a chief's son. He was a well of ancient knowledge, and the men, practical and pragmatic, recognized its value. But Eleanor and Neshoba knew this was only a temporary peace. Croft was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. The failure of his plan with the cattle would only make him more determined and more dangerous. "He will not use pawns like Jebediah again," Neshoba said one evening, as they reviewed the ranch's defenses. "His next move will be more direct. He will try to break us." "The loan," Eleanor said, her stomach tightening. "The final payment is due in 1 month. We don't have it. We were counting on the sale of the summer herd to make it, but with the missing cattle and the price drops, we'll be thousands of dollars short." This was Croft's endgame. The sabotaged well, the stolen cattle, the poisoned morale. It was all designed to ensure they would default on the loan. Once that happened, the foreclosure notice would be served, and the ranch, along with the pass to the Silver Rich Mountains, would be his. "We can't sell more of the herd," Eleanor reasoned, pacing the cabin floor. "It would cripple us for years to come, and there's no one else to borrow from. Croft has made sure of that." Neshoba watched her, his expression calm and thoughtful. "There is another way, a way he will not expect." He unrolled an old, hand-drawn map of the territory, one passed down through his family. It was more detailed than any map Eleanor had ever seen, showing not just rivers and mountains, but ancient trails, hidden springs, and landmarks known only to the Apache. He pointed to a section of the mountains deep within his people's lands. "Here," he said, "there's a place my ancestors called the Sunken Valley, a place of geothermal springs and rare herbs that grow nowhere else. The traders at the Santa Fe outpost pay a high price for them, for their medicinal properties." Eleanor leaned closer, her eyes tracing the faint lines on the map. "I've never heard of it." "It is a protected place," Neshoba explained. "Difficult to reach. The journey is hard and dangerous. But if we can gather enough of the herbs and get them to Santa Fe before the loan is due, we will have the money we need." It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. The journey to Santa Fe was over 200 miles through harsh, unforgiving territory, much of it controlled by rival tribes or roamed by bandits. To attempt it with a valuable cargo would be to paint a target on their backs. "We'd never make it," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "Croft has eyes and ears everywhere. He knew what we were doing before we were even a day out. He will know what we want him to know," Neshoba countered. He looked at her, a glint of strategic fire in his eyes. "We will make him believe we are driving a small herd of our best cattle to the fort for a quick sale. A desperate move. He will expect that. He will send his men to stop us on the main trail." He then traced a second, fainter line on the map, a path that wound through the high, treacherous mountain passes. But we will not be on the main trail. You, my father, and your most trusted men will create the diversion with the cattle. While Croft's men are chasing ghosts, I will take the mountain path. Alone, alone. Eleanor's heart leaped in her throat. No, it's too dangerous. I'm going with you. Eleanor, the path is not safe for a woman, she finished, her eyes flashing with defiance. I have ridden these lands my entire life. I can shoot, I can track, and I know every rock and ravine our side of that mountain. You will need a guide. You will need someone to watch your back. You will need me. Neshoba studied her face for a long moment. He saw the fierce determination in her eyes, the unwavering resolve in the set of her jaw. She was no longer just the rancher's daughter who had been forced into a marriage. She was a warrior, a partner. She was his wife. A slow smile spread across his face, a rare and genuine expression that transformed his rugged features. Your spirit is as strong as the mountain itself, he said, his voice filled with a deep, resonating admiration. We will go together. The plan was set. For the next week, they made their preparations in secret. Walter and Hank were brought into the circle of trust. While they openly prepared a small herd of cattle for the drive to the fort, Eleanor and Neshoba secretly gathered supplies for their true journey. They packed dried meat, water skins, blankets, and leather pouches for the precious herbs they hoped to find. Eleanor felt a thrill of nervous energy she hadn't felt in years. This was not about passive survival anymore. This was about taking the fight to the enemy. It was about taking control of their own destiny. The night before they were to leave, Neshoba gave her a gift. It was a knife, its handle crafted from the antler of a great stag, its blade forged from dark, resilient steel. It was perfectly balanced, fitting in her hand as if it were made for her. My grandfather made this, he said, his voice low. It has protected my family for generations. Now, it will protect you. Eleanor looked from the beautiful, deadly weapon to the face of the man who was giving it to her. In that moment, she understood the true meaning of their union. It wasn't about land or water rights. It was about the joining of two people, two worlds, into a single, unbreakable bond. They were from different cultures, different families, but their hearts now beat with the same purpose: to protect their home, their future, their family. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He simply nodded, his hand briefly covering hers as she held the knife. The touch was a silent promise. Whatever lay ahead in the treacherous mountains and the lawless lands beyond, they would face it as one. The next chapter of their fight was about to begin, and the stakes had never been higher. Under the cloak of a moonless night, they slipped away from the ranch. Walter and Hank created a convincing scene at the main corral, their loud voices and the lowing of cattle creating the perfect diversion. They would ride east at first light, leading Croft spies on a wild goose chase across the open plains. Meanwhile, Eleanor and Neshoba, leading two sturdy pack mules, melted into the western shadows, heading for the jagged black silhouette of the mountains. The ascent was grueling. The trail Neshoba followed was barely a trail at all, but a series of ancient markers visible only to his trained eye: a strangely shaped rock, a lightning-scarred juniper, a particular pattern of lichen on a cliff face. Eleanor, who thought she knew these foothills, was humbled by the hidden world he revealed to her. He moved with a quiet, tireless rhythm, his large body navigating the treacherous terrain with an agility that continued to surprise her. She followed his lead, her initial anxiety giving way to a focused determination. She learned to place her feet where he placed his, to read the subtle shifts in the wind, to listen to the silence of the high country. They moved as a single unit, their communication often wordless, conveyed through a shared glance or a simple hand gesture. Days bled into one another, a blur of steep climbs, rocky descents, and cold nights huddled by a small, smokeless fire. In the shared hardship of the journey, the last vestiges of their former lives, the rancher's daughter, the Apache chief's son, fell away. They were simply Eleanor and Neshoba, two partners against the world. One evening, as they made camp on a high ledge overlooking a vast, empty expanse, Eleanor found herself watching him as he prepared their meager meal. She noticed the small, fine lines around his eyes, the way he treated every task, no matter how small, with a deliberate, focused respect. He was not the fearsome, silent stranger from her wedding day. He was a man of substance, of quiet dignity, a man who carried the weight of his people's history in his steady gaze. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice startling her from her thoughts. He handed her a piece of dried meat. "I was just thinking," she admitted, "about how different this is from the life I imagined." "Is it a worse life?" he asked, his question simple and direct. Eleanor considered it. She thought of the comfortable, predictable future she had once craved. A marriage to a local rancher, children, a life spent within the familiar fences of her family's land. It seemed like a dream from another lifetime, a story about someone else. "No," she said, her voice filled with a surprising certainty. "It's not worse. It's real. I feel more alive up here, with nothing but a knife and a water skin, than I ever did planning for a future that was never truly my own." Neshoba nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "My father says a person does not know the strength of their own spirit until it is tested by the mountain. The mountain does not care about your name or your plans. It asks only that you endure." Their conversation was cut short by a sound that did not belong in the high country, the sharp, metallic click of a rifle being cocked. Instinctively, Neshoba threw himself at Eleanor, pushing her behind the cover of a rocky outcrop as a bullet whined past where she had been sitting, striking sparks against the stone. Another shot echoed through the canyon, then another. They were pinned down. "Croft's men," Eleanor breathed, her heart pounding. "But how? How did they find us?" "They did not follow us from the ranch," Neshoba whispered, his eyes scanning the opposite ridge, where the muzzle flashes had appeared. "They were waiting. They know this route." The terrible realization dawned on them. Croft hadn't just suspected a trick, he had anticipated it. He had men who knew these mountains, perhaps mercenaries or desperate men who would do anything for his silver. He had laid a trap within a trap. "There are 3 of them," Neshoba said, his voice a low, calm whisper, "spread out along the ridge. They have the high ground. We cannot go forward or back." Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at Eleanor. They were exposed, outgunned. The sunken valley, the herbs, the money for the loan, it was all slipping away. But then she felt the solid weight of the antler-handled knife at her belt. She looked at Neshoba's face, calm and focused even as bullets ricocheted around them, and her fear was replaced by a cold, clear anger. They had come too far to die here. "The rock slide," she whispered urgently, her mind racing. She remembered this ledge from rides with her father years ago. "There's a section of loose shale about 50 yards above them. My father always said a loud noise could bring it down." Neshoba's eyes followed her gaze. He saw it immediately, the unstable slope of fractured rock, poised like a hammer over the heads of the men who were shooting at them. A plan began to form. "It is a great risk," he said. "Doing nothing is a greater one," she countered. He gave her a look of profound respect. "Stay here," he commanded. "Do not move until I return." Before she could protest, he was gone, melting into the shadows with the silence of a hunting cat. Eleanor pressed herself against the cold stone, listening to the crack of the rifles and the whine of bullets. Every shot made her flinch, her mind filled with a terrible fear for Neshoba's safety. She clutched the handle of her knife, its solid weight a small comfort in the terrifying darkness. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The shooting became more sporadic as the gunmen realized they couldn't get a clear shot. They were trying to wait them out, to force them to make a mistake. Then, a new sound cut through the night. It started as a low rumble, a deep vibration she felt in her chest more than heard with her ears. The rumble grew into a deafening roar, the sound of a mountain tearing itself apart. The rock slide. The shouts of alarm from the opposite ridge were cut short by the crushing, grinding sound of tons of rock and shale cascading down the slope. The roaring continued for a full minute, echoing through the canyons, before finally settling into a deep, profound silence. The shooting had stopped. Eleanor waited, her body trembling, her eyes straining to see through the thick cloud of dust that now obscured the ridge. Had it worked? Was Neshoba safe? A hand on her shoulder made her gasp and spin around, her knife flashing in the starlight. Neshoba stood there, his face grim, but his eyes alive. "It is done," he said. "The path is blocked. They will not trouble us again." He had circled around them in the darkness, climbing the treacherous cliff face to a point above the slide, and had used the weight of a single, carefully chosen boulder to trigger the avalanche. He had not killed the men. He had simply removed them from the board, burying their position and their path of pursuit under a mountain of rock. It was a solution that was both brilliant and merciful. Relief washed over Eleanor in a wave so powerful it made her knees weak. She reached out, her hand finding his arm, needing the solid, physical proof that he was real, that he was safe. "I thought," she began, her voice cracking. "I was so afraid." Neshoba's hand covered hers, his grip firm and warm. In the pale starlight, he looked down at her, and she saw an emotion in his eyes that went beyond partnership, beyond respect. It was a look of deep, profound connection, an acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in the heart of the mountain, under the threat of death. "Fear is a warning," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "It tells us what we have to lose. And I was afraid of losing you, Eleanor." In that moment, standing on the high, lonely ledge, surrounded by the silent, ancient mountains, Eleanor Vance knew her life had been irrevocably changed. She had been forced to marry a stranger to save her family's legacy. But she now understood that this man, this quiet, powerful, and honorable man, was not the price of that legacy. He was its future, and she, in turn, was his. They reached the sunken valley at dawn 2 days later. It was a place of impossible beauty, a lush, green sanctuary hidden in the rocky heart of the mountains. Steam rose from geothermal pools, and the air was thick with the scent of strange, vibrant flowers. And there, growing in sheltered patches near the warm springs, were the herbs, their leaves a deep, silvery green, shimmering in the morning light. They had made it. The first part of their desperate gamble had paid off. Now, all they had to do was get back. The journey back was a race against time. They pushed themselves and the mules to their limits, traveling with a desperate urgency that left little room for rest. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuer. The pouches filled with the silvery green herbs were a heavy weight, not just in their packs, but on their minds. They represented their only hope. They arrived back at the edge of the Vance property, with less than a day to spare before the loan was due. They were exhausted, bruised, and caked in the dust of the trail, but they were alive, and they had succeeded. They met Walter at a prearranged spot, a hidden shepherd's camp in the low foothills. The old rancher's face, creased with worry, broke into a wide smile of relief when he saw them. "We did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he clasped Neshoba's shoulder. "We led them on a merry chase. Croft's men are probably halfway to Kansas by now." "Croft himself is not so easily fooled," Neshoba warned. "He will be at the bank tomorrow, ready to take possession of this land. We must get these herbs to the trader." Walter nodded, his expression turning grim. "The trader from Santa Fe is in town. He's staying at the hotel, waiting to meet with Croft about a business proposition. It seems our friend Silas has been promising him exclusive access to certain resources in the mountains." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Croft hadn't just been planning to take their land. He was already selling off its secrets. "Then we will give the trader a better deal," Eleanor said, a determined glint in her eye. The next morning, the town was buzzing. It was the day the Vance loan was due, and the foreclosure was the subject of gossip on every street corner. Silas Croft stood on the steps of the bank, a portrait of smug satisfaction, a gold watch in his hand as he theatrically counted down the minutes to noon. At 11:45, a dusty wagon rattled down the main street. At the reins was Walter Vance. Beside him, looking tired but resolute, sat Eleanor. The townspeople stopped and stared, their whispers falling silent. They expected to see a family defeated, ready to be evicted. They did not expect the quiet dignity with which the Vances held their heads high. The wagon stopped in front of the bank. Walter, holding a heavy leather satchel, got down and walked past Croft without a word. Eleanor followed, but instead of going into the bank, she turned and walked toward the hotel, where the Santa Fe trader, a shrewd, well-dressed man named Mr. Peterson, was watching the proceedings with a curious eye. Inside the bank, Walter emptied the satchel onto the counter. A cascade of silver coins and bank notes spilled out, far more than the amount required to settle the loan. The bank manager's eyes widened. Silas Croft, who had followed him in, stared at the money, his face a mask of disbelief. "The Vance debt," Walter said, his voice ringing with a strength it hadn't held in years. "Paid in full, with a little extra for the trouble." Croft's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "Where did you get this?" he snarled. "You were broke. You." His words were cut off by the sound of the door opening. Eleanor entered, followed by Mr. Peterson. The trader's face was alight with excitement. "Silas, my friend," Peterson said, though his tone was anything but friendly. "It seems you've been less than forthcoming in our negotiations. You offer me potential access to a silver mine, a risky and expensive venture. But this young lady," he said, gesturing to Eleanor, "has just offered me something far more valuable. An exclusive contract for a renewable, predictable, and highly profitable resource." He held up a small pouch. From it, he pulled a sprig of the silvery green herb. "Sunken Valley Botanicals," Peterson announced, his voice carrying throughout the crowded bank. "The rarest medicinal herbs in the territory, worth more than their weight in gold to the apothecaries in the East. And it seems the only safe passage to this valley is through Vance land. Land which, I believe, you no longer have any claim to." Croft stared, his mind finally grasping the full scope of his defeat. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted. He looked from the money on the counter to the herb in Peterson's hand, then to the calm, defiant face of Eleanor Vance. The smiling wolf finally showed his teeth. "This is a trick," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "This is Apache magic, a swindle. The only swindler here is you, Mr. Croft," a deep voice said from the doorway. Neshoba stood there, his large frame filling the entrance. He was not dressed in his travel-worn leathers, but in the formal regalia of his people. His presence commanded an immediate, respectful silence. The townspeople, who had once seen him as a simple savage, now saw a leader, a man of immense power and authority. "You have used lies and deceit to prey on desperate men," Neshoba continued, his voice calm but carrying an absolute, unshakable authority. "You try to set my people against my wife's people. You sabotage their well. You try to murder us in the mountains. You did all this not for land or for water, but for greed. The silver you crave will remain in the mountain, protected, as it has for generations. This land is not for you." Croft was cornered. His crimes, once secret whispers, were now being declared in the open, in front of the very people he had sought to control. He looked wildly around, seeking an ally, an escape, but he found only cold, accusing stares. His power, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, had crumbled to dust. He was ruined. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the porch of the main ranch house, watching the sun set over a land that was finally, truly, hers. The ranch was thriving. The contract with Mr. Peterson had brought a prosperity her family had never known. The well was clear, the fences were mended, and the cattle were fat and healthy. She heard a familiar, heavy footstep behind her and turned to see Neshoba. He came and stood beside her, his presence a warm, solid comfort. In the months since their victory over Croft, their partnership had deepened into a love that was as quiet, strong, and enduring as the mountains themselves. He had taught her the language of the land, and she had taught him the language of her heart. They had found in each other not just a spouse, but a soulmate. "The men are asking when we will have the branding feast," he said, a hint of a smile in his deep voice. "Tell them to be patient," Eleanor replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "A good feast takes time to prepare." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from orange to purple. She thought of her wedding day, of the fear and resentment she had felt. She had been forced to marry a stranger to save a dying legacy. She had been so focused on what she thought she was losing that she had been blind to what she was gaining. Neshoba was not a price she had to pay. He was a gift she had not known how to receive. He saved her family, not with money or force, but with wisdom, honor, and a strength of spirit that had taught her the true meaning of the word. He was her husband, her partner, her home. The life she was living was nothing like the one she had imagined. It was harder, richer, and more beautiful than she could have ever dreamed. It was real, and as Neshoba's arm wrapped around her, pulling her close, Eleanor knew that the greatest stories are not the ones we plan, but the ones that life, in its infinite and surprising wisdom, writes for us. 2 years later, the first snows of winter were dusting the high peaks of the mountains, turning them a brilliant, pristine white against the crisp blue sky. Eleanor stood on the porch, a thick woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching her son, a sturdy toddler with his father's dark hair and her blue eyes, take clumsy steps across the yard. He was chasing a puppy, his delighted giggles echoing in the clean, cold air. The Vance Ranch, now the Vance Neshoba Ranch, as it was officially known on the new deed filed at the county courthouse, was a place transformed. The treaty that had begun as a business arrangement had blossomed into a true, lasting peace. The Apache and the ranchers now traded freely, sharing knowledge and resources. Children from both communities played together, their laughter a testament to the bridge that Eleanor and Neshoba had built between their two worlds. Neshoba's father, the old chief, was a frequent visitor. He would sit on the porch for hours with Walter, the two old men, once separated by a chasm of culture and history, now finding common ground in their shared love for their children and their grandson. They would smoke in companionable silence, watching the boy, a living symbol of the future they had all helped to create. Neshoba came up the steps, his boots making a solid, reassuring sound on the wooden planks. He had been down at the river, checking the new irrigation gates they had designed together, a system that blended his people's ancient understanding of water with modern engineering, ensuring the ranch would remain fertile for generations to come. He wrapped his strong arms around Eleanor from behind, resting his chin on her head as they watched their son together. "He has your stubbornness," Neshoba murmured, his voice a low, warm rumble against her ear. Eleanor smiled, leaning back into his embrace. "And he has your strength. I saw him try to lift one of Hank's saddles yesterday." They shared a quiet laugh. Their life was full of these simple, peaceful moments, moments that were more precious than all the silver in the mountains. The memory of Silas Croft and the desperate struggle to save their home seemed like a story from another lifetime. Croft had left the territory in disgrace, a broken man whose name was now only spoken as a cautionary tale against greed. His downfall had served as a stark lesson, and a new era of cooperation had dawned in the valley, born from the ashes of his failed schemes. "Mr. Peterson's man was here," Eleanor said, turning in his arms to face him. "The payment for the autumn harvest of herbs was even larger than we expected. He says the doctors in the big cities are calling them a miracle. The earth provides for those who respect it," Neshoba said simply. She looked up into his face, into the dark, intelligent eyes that had first seen through the lies and betrayals that had almost destroyed her family. She remembered the fear and anger of her wedding day, the humiliation of being bound to a man she saw as an obese, silent stranger. How blind she had been. She had judged him by his size, by his silence, by the prejudice of her people. She had failed to see the keen intellect, the unwavering honor, and the profound capacity for love that lay beneath the surface. He had seen the truth of her land, and in time, he had taught her to see the truth of his heart. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "I was just thinking about a foolish young woman who once stood in a dusty yard and thought her life was over," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She thought she was being sacrificed. She had no idea she was being saved." A slow, genuine smile spread across Neshoba's face, the kind of smile that still made her heart skip a beat. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that spoke of shared trials, of deep and abiding love, and of a future that was as vast and promising as the land that stretched out before them. Their son, having finally caught the puppy, let out a triumphant squeal, and together, they turned to watch him, their family, their legacy, a testament to the unexpected and beautiful path their lives had taken. They had faced the storm together and had not only survived, but had learned to soar above it, building a new world from the pieces of the old. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey with Eleanor and Neshoba, a story that reminds us that true strength and love can be found in the most unexpected of places. We truly hope you enjoyed it. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. Did you enjoy their story? And where in the world are you watching from today? Your thoughts and your presence in our community mean everything to us. And if you'd like to see more unforgettable stories like this one, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new tale. Thank you again for watching. We'll see you in the next story.